All right, well, let's get one last question here from the Cult of Cornette Facebook group. Jim, this one was...
The coveted Cult of Cornette Facebook group.
The most exclusive Facebook group in the history of the stupid wrestling Facebook groups. This one is from Edward Whipkey. During the Dick Hutton NWA title history discussion on the Drive-Thru a few weeks ago, I was wondering why didn't Lou Thesz drop the NWA title to Verne Gagne? Verne had the things Lou wanted in an NWA champion. Did Lou and Verne have heat?
Well, no, I don't know if it was as much Lou and Verne personally as Verne and the NWA, or at least, Sam Muchnick, the people that made the decisions, right? Because of the U.S. title thing with Fred Kohler. Before we explain that to everybody else, that's what I'm thinking was the issue. Is that what you're thinking?
I don't think Lou Thesz wanted to drop it to Verne Gagne. I can't speak specific to the reasons. But
not at the time that,
he handpicked Hutton.
Yeah.
But Verne Gagne had been the U.S. champion for Fred Kohler on the Dumont Network, national TV, and that was presented as being an equal to the world champion, which conflicted with everything the NWA stood for.
Well, and also the money, the payoff, they were doing the same thing with Gagne as they were doing with Thesz in asking for 10% for the champion and a whatever percent booking fee, right? Which also pissed off the NWA.
And the Sheik was rubbing his chin saying, that's interesting. I like this idea.
But yeah, I mean, in the early 50s, when Gagne first got into business and was really hot on television, Thesz did not intend to drop the title then to him or anybody else. And then the story that I always heard was by the time that, it was going to be even discussed that Thesz would drop it, that Gagne had heat, probably with, Thesz personally, but also with the NWA, because he had that run with the U.S. title and had done the percentage deal and had basically taken business away from the NWA champion because of the Chicago network television being so hot. And that's the one that Thesz was the NWA champion, but he was never really regularly on any of the network TV. I mean, there's obviously matches from Chicago because that was the big wrestling market and he was there, but he didn't center himself on any of the television programs like Gagne was pretty much featured on the Chicago program. Gorgeous George was featured on the Hollywood wrestling from Los Angeles. But Thesz, because he traveled and the NWA champion didn't make a lot of defenses that would even be seen on TV. So Gagne probably cut into their income there for a few years in the early 50s.
Let me ask you this too. Obviously, Buddy Rogers does not get the NWA title until 1961. So there's a few years there in between where you could argue someone like Buddy Rogers maybe should have gotten the belt instead of a Dick Hutton. If Verne had gotten it then, would he have been too similar to Thesz, who had just had it?
Possibly, because, also at that point, Rogers is getting to be one of the biggest box office attractions in the business. Well, he had been a huge draw since the late 40s, but
yeah.
At that point, Gagne was hotter because of the TV in the early 50s, but by 1956, 57, Gagne has just gone back to Minnesota, bought into the office, but Buddy Rogers is drawing bigger houses in a more wider variety of places than Gagne was at that point. And of course, Thesz hated Rogers because of what he had said about Lewis, Strangler Lewis, so he wasn't going to put Buddy Rogers over ever, which he never did. But he could have picked somebody else than Dick Hutton, but he wanted a real wrestler. Hutton had won the NCAA title, and he wanted the guy that they were using in the 40s, but now it's the 50s and it's TV, and Rogers' shit is getting over. And that's, so that's another thing that hurt the NWA there was Hutton being the champion and promoters dropped out. And when they finally, Thesz came back, and then the fucking, they got Pat O'Connor, who was a draw at that point as a great babyface, but he was more he was flashier than Gagne was. And he had all his hair by that point.
You know, the other thing to throw into the mix here that it's important to remember, I think he drops the belt to Dick Hutton in 57. It's the same year that everything happens with him and Carpentier in Chicago. So it's not like there wasn't another option they even were playing with at that moment. Carpentier was the NWA champion in various places.
And see, Carpentier was the opposite of Thesz in that he was not a real wrestler, a hooker, a shooter, but he was an acrobatic, television-friendly performer with that style. But because he was so hot at the gate, especially in that first 5-year period when he was like the French Rocca, Thesz was willing to do it because they probably said, Jesus Christ, Lou, the last fucking guy almost put us out of business. Help us out here.
If they had went with Carpentier, they would have skipped right over Pat O'Connor. They would have went from a Carpentier to Buddy Rogers.
Yeah. And O'Connor, from everything that everybody says, and there's obviously, some footage, but he was so smooth and so flashy and good looking and young and athletic that he was a perfect babyface champion, but he really had no gimmick besides he's a good looking, nice New Zealand fella. So, well, that's the thing they're seeing Rogers. It's like it was Flair 20 years beforehand. He attracted attention. So O'Connor, the only reason O'Connor drew the big house in Chicago was people knew or hoped that Buddy Rogers was going to win the fucking belt, even though he was the heel. That was the first kind of, I won't say the first ever, the first on a big time or national basis where the people were kind of like waiting to see the heel win this thing.
And the other thing I guess we should point out, George Shire always talks about this. And I did see one of the questions here in the Facebook group was asking about a good book about the AWA history. I have it here on my shelf. Minnesota's...
Sounded like you had it in a barrel.
I just looked behind me. Minnesota's Golden Age of Wrestling by George Shire is a book people should check out. This was also at a period of time where the antitrust issues with the NWA were taking place. It benefited the NWA that longtime member Wally Carbo and Verne Gagne had their own thing that they could work with very easily, but it was something separate. Separate to show that it wasn't just the NWA dominating everything.
Well, yeah, that's the thing is because they didn't, nobody, Gagne had been such a big star in the business. When he goes back to his hometown and buys into the established office, nobody wants to, the rest of the NWA, they didn't want to fuck with him. And it had not been an NWA stronghold to begin with up to that point, where, they were doing their title changes regularly in Minneapolis or whatever. And then finally, he's, well, why can't I be the world champion? And I got all this country up here that you guys aren't fucking with. So it was peaceful coexistence. And before cable, nobody knew the difference. People in the Midwest thought it was Verne Gagne, and the people in almost everywhere else thought it was whoever the NWA champion was. And then New York had Bruno.